This is going to be a brief introduction to the identity property for multiplication. There are some practice slides on here as well. The identity property for addition states that when adding 0, you will get the same answer. The reason why I have this in here is because we just got done with this property when we were going over addition properties. So remember how if we have 4 plus 0, our answer will stay the same as 4. If we had negative 5 plus 0, our answer will be the same, negative 5. Okay? But when we are multiplying, when we think about identity property for multiplying, I don't want you to think about 0 anymore, because there's actually 3 different scenarios that we need to think about when multiplying. The first one is, let's go ahead and see what happens if we multiply by 1. Okay, so if we have negative 6 times 1, okay, we will get negative 6 because they're different signs, so negative 6 times a positive will end in a negative. So therefore, technically, the negative 6 does not change. Okay, so I can do that again. Negative 11 times positive 1 will be negative 11. It's the same value. So when multiplying, anything times 1 will be that number itself. Okay, now what if we multiplied by negative 1? Okay, so negative 6 times negative 1 will end in a positive 6. So this time, negative 6 ended up changing to a positive 6. So technically, this negative 1 value right here affected our expression. The same thing goes with negative 11. If we multiply that by a negative 1, well, we end up getting a positive 11. So the negative 1 does not allow the negative 11 to keep its true identity. That negative 11 changes to a positive. So therefore, the negative 11 loses its identity and becomes positive. So negative 1 is not affiliated, okay, with the multiplication identity. Now let's try 0. If we have negative 6 times 0, you know it, anything times 0 will be 0. Okay, and negative 11 times 0, well, anything times 0 will be 0. Pretty simple, isn't it? All right, let's get some practice. So on your paper in the first box, go ahead and write this expression down, negative 4 times negative 6 divided by 3 times 1. So we are going to perform the identity property here first of multiplication. Here we see a positive 1. Well, remember, if it's positive 1, then we can go ahead and do the identity property of multiplication. So let's go ahead and rewrite everything. But let's leave the 1 out because technically 1 times anything in here will stay the same. If we take 3 times 1, it'll be 3. If we take negative 6 times 1, it'll be negative 6, okay, and so forth. So off to the right in your paper, let's go ahead and put the identity of multiplication. Okay, now we can go ahead and continue simplifying this expression using the other properties that we've already learned. So let's go ahead and turn these whole numbers into fractions just by slipping a 1 underneath. Now let's go ahead and do the multiplicative inverse property. We have negative 4 over 1 times negative 6 over 1. And then this is where we apply the multiplicative inverse by changing that division sign to a multiplication. And then we take the reciprocal of the following fraction, which is 1 over 3. Let's go ahead, keeping our negative numbers together, okay, since they're already next to each other. We don't have to do the commutative property. Let's go straight into the associative. Okay, let's go ahead and group those first two terms, leaving the 1/3 for last. Okay, -4 times -6, well, that's a positive 24. And then when we multiply this across, 24 times 1 is 24, 1 times 3 is 3, 24 divided by 3 is 8. Okay? Okay, so on your worksheet for problem number 2, go ahead and write down -5 divided by 1/4 times -1 times 2/5. So we cannot apply the identity property of multiplication here because this is a -1. And if you remember from earlier, a -1 will have an effect on the expression as a whole and therefore will have an effect on the answer. So you cannot complete the identity property. So let's go ahead and carry this expression out, simplifying it the way we know how to with the multiplicative inverse property first, okay? Before we do that, let's go ahead and put all the whole numbers as a fraction by simply just putting it over 1. We leave the 1/4 and we leave the 2/5. So let's go ahead and apply the multiplicative inverse property. We keep -5 over 1. Change the division symbol to multiplication, affecting and taking the inverse of 1/4, which becomes 4 over 1. Then we get multiplied to -1 over 1, and then multiplied to 2 over 5. And again, this is the multiplicative inverse property. Next, I'm actually going to do the commutative property because I want to get those negative numbers next to each other. Okay, so I'm going to do -5 over 1 times -1 over 1, and then I'm going to put the 4 over 1 next, and then the 2 over 5 last. Let's go ahead and do the associative property to show that we know how to group them. And then, of course, as we group them, that's how we're going to solve it. -5 times a -1 ends in a +5, which is over 1. The 4 times the 2 is 8. 1 times the 5 is 5. If we multiply 5 straight across, 5 times 8 is 40. 1 times 5 is 5. Just divide. 40 divided by 5 is 8. Our answer is 8. Okay, let's do one more problem. Okay, so here we have a 1 within the expression. It's not a -1. So because it's a 1, we can go ahead and do the multiplicative, the identity for multiplication. Okay, and I'm sorry, I should have let you go ahead and write this problem down on your worksheet. So 2/3 times 1 divided by 5, 6 times 0. Go ahead and write down the identity property for multiplication in your right-hand column. And then we're going to go ahead and apply that identity property. So I'm just going to simply put 2/3. And then since I know that 1 times anything will be itself, I'm just going to go ahead and just drop it out of the equation, the expression. And basically just write the expression without it, because 2/3 times 1 is 2/3. All right, so let's go ahead and perform the multiplicative inverse property. In order to change that division to multiplication. And when we do that, make sure you take the inverse of the next fraction. So this will become 6 over 5. And then, of course, multiplying by 0. So now that everything is multiplying, okay, anything times 0 will be 0. That's why I went ahead and changed the division. I went ahead and went through that property and changed it from division to multiplication so that we can see that if anything that's going to be multiplying by 0 will end in 0. So you can solve this any way you want to, okay? But at the end, you will get 0. So you can take these two and multiply it together to get an answer, but eventually you'll have to multiply by that 0, okay? You can even take and start with these two. Multiply those two together, you'll get 0, and then eventually you'll multiply 0 to the 2/3 and get 0. So if you are struggling with this concept, okay, please come to me and I will give you more practice to show you that no matter how you solve it, you will get 0, okay? Okay, so go ahead and move on to the last problem. This problem is going to just be something that you need to do on your own. And then when you are done, check with me to get your answers. So on the fourth, on your worksheet, go ahead and write down this fourth problem. It's -4/5 divided by 2 times 1 divided by 1/5 times -1. Okay, go ahead and apply the properties. You will have to apply the identity property, and you will have to apply the multiplicative inverse property. But go ahead, complete this problem. When you are finished, okay, check with me to get the answers. Good luck.